3 weeks ago, while I was away over spring break, Andrea gave a sermon on the sacrament of healing. I listened to it on the website when I came back, and I really liked the way she started, so I'm going to copy her word for word. You can tell her I said that.
It took a long time to write that.
Yeah. This is the 7th sermon of our Lenten series in which we are exploring the 7 traditional Christian sacraments, and these are visible signs of the invisible truths about God's love. So, I'm done copying Andrea. In this Lenten series, which should be over by now, we have looked at baptism and communion and spiritual formation and forgiveness and healing and marriage/relationships. This week we're beginning to look at the final sacrament. It's going to be a little bit like the Harry Potter movie series. So the final sacrament is part 1 this week and part 2 next week. And this sacrament is traditionally called holy orders, sometimes also called ordination. And sometimes it's thought about as only really applying to people who are officially ordained in a church. But once again, Pamela, in her seemingly infinite wisdom, has expanded the scope of this sacrament to vocation, thinking about how we all are called to serve God in this world, about how we all are called to live out our Christian faith in joy and with integrity. And this is related to the biblical idea of the priesthood of all believers. And while we're talking about this, could we please, in our society, do away with the phrase full-time ministry for people who just happen to be employed by a church? Because we are all of us called to full-time ministry. Anyway, end of rant. Here we are in the Easter then. Okay? Thank you very much. Good night. I'm here all week. As you may know, in the traditional church year, Easter is actually not just one Sunday morning. Last week, Easter Sunday, began the 50-day season of Easter. And on the 50th day of Easter, there's a special day called Pentecost. Think about that. 50 Pentecost. So when I realized that this sermon topic, vocation, was going to fall on, as was the original plan, or just after Easter Sunday, I was instantly reminded of N.T. Wright's book, Surprised by Hope. Ooh, look at that visual aid. There it is. I didn't just put these in willy-nilly to look like I read them. Although that is a common strategy. N.T. Wright, you've probably heard of him. N.T. Wright is an interesting person. A little bit about him. He's from England, and that alone does not make him an interesting person. He was an Anglican bishop for a while. He is a highly regarded historian and biblical scholar and theologian. He has an international academic stature, especially for his work on the resurrection, like very, very academic, detailed work on the resurrection and on the Apostle Paul. Part of what makes him interesting is that he can write general or some so-called popular books seemingly just as well as he can write deep, deep academic books. Also interesting is that he manages to, on a low level, kind of annoy people all over the typical conservative progressive spectrum. So people on the left don't like everything he has to say about marriage, and people on the right don't like that he supports the ordination of women. People on the right aren't happy that he downplays the idea of substitutionary atonement. But everybody agrees that he's a helpful scholar on the resurrection and on the Apostle Paul, and we're dealing with both of those today, so we're on safe ground here. I thought about this book primarily because of the subtitle. Here's the subtitle to his book: Rethinking Heaven, the Resurrection, and the Mission of the Church. In other words, his book is about Easter Sunday, the resurrection, so we're close, and today's sacrament of vocation, that is, what is the mission of the church? What are we to do? Now, we only have one sermon to cover this, and it's a 300-page book. So we'll just take a very introductory look at the three elements of his subtitle. We'll hear what he has to say about heaven, and about the resurrection, and about the mission or vocation of the church. But before that, I just want to make a quick observation, and that is this. So much of my work here in the place, so much of my work is to go out into the world of ideas and biblical studies and theology, etc., 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 and then report back to you what I have found helpful. Often, my sermons are based on the decades now of biblical research and teaching that I've done in my past. Sometimes they're based on conversations I've had with scholars. Sometimes they're based on what I find when I go researching after some of you make a request for a topic. I take requests. I have a little, just write on a piece of paper, put it in the box. And sometimes, like this morning, it's basically a book summary. And I want to be clear that my job isn't really to convince you about anything, except I really do hope to convince you of the reality of God's love. And the more and more we, all of us, hear over and over again that we're loved deeply, the more possible it is for that love to kind of overflow, and makes it easier for us to. It's a lot easier for us to love our neighbors as ourselves if we really do believe we're loved. So that I do hope to convince you about. But everything else, my job is just to read and listen and think, and then humbly summarize and clarify and present it to you. And if you hear something that's helpful, that's great. And if you don't hear anything that's helpful, then thinking about why the sermon wasn't helpful could itself be helpful. So it's kind of sneaky. Anyway, this week it's just a book report, basically. We're going to hear what N.T. Wright has to say about heaven and resurrection and the mission of the church. As soon as I distinguish between knowledge and belief, and here's why I'm saying this. We're going to be talking about death and the afterlife and resurrection. And it's really easy to hear words about these topics and say, yeah, but can we know that? I mean, you can't prove that. And I just want to remind you how few things you actually know. You know that 5 equals 5. In philosophy, that's called too true to be good. It's true. It's not very helpful. I can prove to you that the three angles of a triangle add up to 180 degrees. Is your life transformed? But I don't know, in the sense of there's no doubt whatsoever. I can't prove that Heidi loves me. I believe it. I have reasons to believe it. I think I have good reasons to believe it. But I can't prove it. She could be looking at me every day and thinking, look at her. Not much longer now. And it's life insurance time. Could be. So this sermon is not about Heidi and what she does with her life insurance money. It's about what happens to me in that scenario afterwards. And so we are wandering into territory where, of course, we can't prove things. But just remember, basically everything that's important and rich and good in your life, you can't prove. Everything. It's all about belief and reasons. You don't want to be silly, but it's not about proof. So take these ideas, see if they are reasoned from N.T. Wright, and see if they are helpful. So we start with heaven. And N.T. Wright, for the first third of his book, is basically complaining about what he believes is an all too common misconception in the church. The idea that when we die, we go to heaven. And what he means by that is this idea that Christianity is all about saving souls. And souls are what's left of us when our body dies. So our body dies, our soul goes to heaven to be with Jesus. And for Wright, this indicates a false choice, a false binary. That is, our physical world versus God's non-physical world somewhere else. Where we get to go when we die, if we're good. So we get song lyrics like, "This world is not my home. I'm just a passing through." And we hear ideas like, "Take me home to be with Jesus." And here's what N.T. Wright has to say about all these sorts of things. He writes, "It comes as something of a shock when people are told what is in fact the case, that there is very little in the Bible about going to heaven when you die. And not a lot about a post-death hell either. The medieval pictures of heaven and hell, which were boosted by Dante's great work, have exercised a huge influence on the Western Christian imagination. Many of us grow up assuming that whenever the New Testament speaks of heaven, it refers to the place the saved will go after they die. And many mental pictures have grown up around this and are now assumed to be what the Bible teaches. And Wright says that's not the case. In his book, he has a lot of detail that I can't go into, but that's what he says. And a big source of the problem, according to him, and he's certainly not alone in this, is found in the thought of the ancient Greek philosopher Plato. For Plato, we human beings, are made up of two parts. The body, which is the material, mortal, animal-like part of us. Ew. And the soul, which is the non-material, immortal, God-like part of us. And in Plato's philosophy, it's only the soul that matters. It's only the soul that really is significant. Death simply means the separation of the good soul from the bad body, or more accurately, the freeing of the soul from the prison of the body. The physical world, according to Plato, is something ultimately to leave behind. And you can see how that view has infected Western Christianity, because that sounds pretty familiar. Another related complication is the difficulty we have in translating the biblical Hebrew and biblical Greek words into English. It's never easy to translate. But the biblical words that are translated spirit or soul, almost always in the Bible mean something like, we don't have a word for this, the whole person, the embodied human being, complete with personality and passions and interests. That's your soul. We do sometimes talk about feeling things in our soul or a kindred spirit, and we don't mean a kindred ghost. We mean the full person. But we don't really have a word for it. So when we read soul, because we're so influenced by Plato, we tend to think about the ghost in the machine. And then we're just one small step away from wings and clouds and harps and infinite boredom. But the biblical story is not, repeat, not a story about people finding an escape route out of this physical world that is really a prison. That is not the biblical story. Movement in the biblical story is there. But the movement is not from heaven, from earth to heaven. That is not the movement from earth to heaven, if we think of heaven as where God is. The movement in the biblical story is always from heaven to earth. And I want to demonstrate that with just a few pictures throughout the entire Bible. I'm starting with Genesis, ending with Revelation, so buckle up. In the very beginning of Genesis, we find God where? Walking in the garden in the cool of the day. In the middle of the story of the Tower of Babel, but the Lord came down to see the city that the people were building. In the Exodus out of slavery from Egypt, God hears the call of the Israelites and then joins them. As they travel out of Egypt, he comes down and meets Moses on Mount Sinai, and then he leads them all to the Promised Land. And then, of course, like the best card I have in my hand here, the incarnation, for heaven's sake. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel, which means God with us. Not secret escape route for humans. At the ascension of Jesus, the angels did not say to the poor, confused disciples, "Hey, one day you too will get to fly up out of this world." Instead, they pointed the disciples to this. This same Jesus will come back in the same way you have seen him go. And then consider the pictures and messages we get at the very end of the Bible in the book of Revelation. And I'm not talking about the Antichrist or the rapture, two terms, by the way, that do not appear in the book of Revelation. I'm talking about the new Jerusalem, about a new heaven and a new earth. And basically the picture is that the new Jerusalem, which represents heaven, the place where God is, comes down to earth. And then we read, "And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and God will dwell with them.'" And then that book ends with a wedding scene with an image of the eternal unity, the joining together of heaven and earth. And where does that happen? On earth. One almost gets the sense, and a lot of this, by the way, have been my thoughts, not N.T. Wright's, so this is great, you can't even tell who's talking. This next image is mine, not his, just to be clear, so when it fails, don't blame him. You know those big department stores where there are escalators going up and going down, but they're not parallel? One's going this way and the other's going this way, making a kind of an X. You know what I'm talking about? And it's in the open air, so you can look over and you can see who's going down when you're going up. Imagine this. God is on the down escalator. Emmanuel. God with us, joyously on his way to join the people on earth at the end of history. Meanwhile, we Platonic Western Christians are on the up escalator, desperate to get out of this nasty physical world. And both God and the Platonic Christians are looking at each other with faces that say, "Wait, where are you going?" So how shall we think about heaven? N.T. Wright has a very clever little quip. You can almost get this on a bumper sticker. Heaven is important, but it's not the end of the world. Meaning, it's not the goal, it's not the ultimate destination, it's not the purpose. Because heaven, he writes, and I'm reading a long quotation here, heaven is actually, in the Bible, a reverent way of speaking about God. So that riches in heaven, as a phrase, simply means the riches that are in God's presence. So by extension, he writes, heaven can be understood as the place where God's purposes for the future are stored up. Heaven is the place where God's purposes for the future are stored up. It isn't where they are meant to stay, so that you have to go to heaven to enjoy them. It's where they are kept safe against the day when they'll become a reality on earth. And perhaps sensing that he's writing kind of high, vague stuff, he makes it very concrete. If I say to a friend, "I've kept some beer in the fridge for you," that doesn't mean my friend has to climb into the fridge to enjoy the beer. Heaven is like the fridge. So then, heaven, as a place of disembodied spirits floating about in a disembodied world, is a mistaken way of thinking, he says. So what then should we think about life and then death and then life after death and so forth? And that brings us to our second topic, which is resurrection. And N.T. Wright starts his discussion of resurrection in a way that will be very familiar to us this year with our focus on exegesis. Because he begins by asking, what did the word resurrection mean to the disciples and to the early church? What did the word mean in the ancient world in general? That would actually be a good place to start. When they're using this term, what do they mean? And here's the answer I'm reading, the word resurrection in its Greek, Latin, or other equivalents was never used to mean life after death. Resurrection was used to describe new bodily life after whatever sort of life after death there might be. I'll repeat that. Resurrection is about bodies. It's about physical life after whatever life after death might look like. Resurrection in the ancient world was understood as the second step of a two-step process. First, there's life after death, which might be something like a non-physical resting place for those who have died. You read it all through the Old Testament, actually. Has gone to rest with his fathers. That's the idea of life after death, just a kind of a rest, like a nap time for the souls. And then, after a time, at the end of history, there is resurrection, which is physical. And again, I'm reading here from Wright. Everybody in the ancient world knew about ghosts and spirits and visions and hallucinations and things like this. Most people in the ancient world believed in these things. And they were quite clear that these weren't what they meant by resurrection. Resurrection meant bodies. We cannot emphasize this too strongly. So for Wright, and this is the phrase he uses throughout the book, resurrection is physical life after death. And sometimes he refers to it as simply life after death. It turns out that in the time of Jesus, so first of all, everyone in the ancient world, that's what they meant by resurrection. But not everyone believed it, but that's what they meant by the term. So, in the ancient world, if you were asked, do you believe in resurrection? The question meant, not do you believe in ghosts and life after death and things like that, because most people did believe in that. Do you believe that after that, there is a physical resurrection? Some Jews did believe in the physical resurrection at the end of history. The Pharisees were those Jews. And some Jews did not believe in a physical life at the end of history, and that the Sadducees were those who did not. But nobody, and I mean nobody, in the ancient world ever thought that a physical life after death would ever happen to one person in the middle of history. Maybe at the end of history for everybody, but not for one person in the middle. And that is what is so surprising about the Christian story for the early Christians. That's the core of the Christian understanding of life, death, resurrection, salvation, the shape of salvation history. Everything that you read in the New Testament is shaped by this surprising proclamation, a physical fact for the people who were eyewitnesses, that for one person in the middle of history, this happened. Jesus experienced death. They saw it for themselves. He must have had some kind of life after death, because he then had a physical resurrection. And that changed everything. It gave them hope, surprising hope, hence the title, Surprised by Hope, of the book. Because they came to understand that what happened to Jesus in the middle of history is going to happen to all of us at the end of history. This is the Christian proclamation, and we even have a passage in Paul where it says Jesus is the first fruit of the harvest that will come at the end of time. Death, then, does not have the last word. Now, in churches with older traditions, there are every week prayers offered up, not necessarily to the dead or for the dead, but just remembering those who have died. And the ancient prayer goes like this: may they rest in peace and rise in glory. Do you hear the two steps? May they rest in peace, that's the life after death. May they rise in glory, that's the physical resurrection. And N.T. Wright, the historian, finds it very, very interesting that although in the first 2 centuries of the church, people had so many different perspectives and different views on so many different things, but all of them landed on this. They all held this in common. This allows N.T. Wright to finally give a correction to the going to heaven idea that still is bothering him on page 167. He writes, "I am repeatedly frustrated by how hard it is to get this point through the thick wall of traditional thought and language. The ultimate destination is not going to heaven when you die, but being bodily raised into the transformed, glorious likeness of Jesus Christ." So he says, if we insist on speaking of going to heaven when we die, we should be clear that this represents the first and far less important stage of a two-stage process. Heaven is important, but it's not the end of the world. Resurrection isn't life after death, it's life after death. Another implication of this is that we see in Jesus a glimpse of our ultimate future. What do we see in the resurrected Jesus? Do we see a ghost on the up escalator? No. We see a body. A body with new capabilities, obviously. But also a body that has a kind of continuity with his pre-death body. Where do we find evidence of this continuity? The scars are there on his hands and feet and in his side. He is recognizably Jesus when he wants to be recognized. He eats. He cooks. And all of that, if you think of it, is the ultimate affirmation of this physical created world. Creation, physical creation, is, as God saw in early Genesis, it is indeed good. Very good. It's the place where God is. It's the place where God will dwell. It's hard to get more complimented than that. And the understanding of the early church was that the resurrection of Jesus was step one, not just for us, humans, but for the entire created world. The idea that all creation groans and waits in expectation for the resurrection. So we don't have in the Bible the bad physical earth versus the good spiritual heaven. We don't have that in the Bible. Instead, if we have two steps, two things, it's the beginning of the resurrected reality that we see in Jesus and the promise of the ultimate resurrected reality yet to come for all creation. This is the very center of our hope, says N.T. Wright. In fact, he gets a little snarky and says this: take away the stories of Jesus' birth, and you lose only 2 chapters of Matthew and 2 chapters of Luke. But take away the resurrection, and you lose the entire New Testament. So this is the core. But there are also surprising political implications about all of this for Christians in the early century, because death does not have the last word, and that is bad news for empires and dictators and authoritarians. Because according to Wright, death is the last weapon of the tyrant. And the point of the resurrection is that death itself has been defeated. And if death has been overthrown, then so have those whose power depends on the threat of death. They've been overthrown too. And he reminds us of a scene from Oscar Wilde's play Salome. It's a funny scene. Herod hears reports that Jesus of Nazareth has been raising the dead, and Herod says, "I do not wish him to do that. I forbid him to do that. I allow no man to raise the dead. This man Jesus must be found and told that I forbid him to raise the dead." Herod senses that his ultimate power, his ultimate threat is undermined. And all of this talk of politics gets us dangerously close to thinking about the mission of the church, so why don't we just do that? Third point, the mission of the church. And T. Wright invites us to put all these things together. The resurrection that is promised for all of us, indeed for all of creation. The idea of physical life after death. Bodies, food. The idea, the promise, the biblical promise that we will have meaningful work to do as priests in this new creation. But also a kind of continuity between that world and this one. Again, remember, Jesus is the first fruit of the harvest. And he had continuity with his pre-death body and the scars and the food and the cooking. And I would like to add, and in the relationships that he had with physical embodied friends. They were still there after the resurrection, those relationships. And with all of this in mind, we are invited to remember this line from the prayer that Jesus taught his disciples. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, where? On earth, as it is in heaven. And think about the passage Pamela read to us earlier from 1 Corinthians 15. This begins with therefore, and just so you know, this therefore is Paul finally coming to the conclusion after a long section on the resurrection and what it means for us. And here's the conclusion. Therefore, my dear brothers and sisters, stand firm, let nothing move you. Always give yourselves fully to the work of the Lord, and here's the kicker, because you know, as a result of all this thinking of the resurrection and the world to come and how it's related to the world now, because you know that your labor is not in vain. On earth as it is in heaven, our work is not in vain. There's a kind of continuity between this world and the next. And here's how Wright puts all of this together. Paul says what you do with your body in the present matters because God has a great future in store for your body. And if this applies to ethics, it certainly also applies to all the various vocations, there's our sacrament, to which God's people are called. What you do in the present, and then he has a long list, by painting, preaching, singing, sewing, praying, teaching, building hospitals, digging wells, campaigning for justice, writing poems, caring for the needy, loving your neighbor as yourself, all of this will last into God's future. That's what the Apostle Paul is saying. These activities aren't simply ways of making the present life a little less beastly until the day the whole world burns up. No, these activities are part of what we may call, he writes, building for God's kingdom. Now, obviously, there's a lot we don't know about that future kingdom. But there are a couple of things we do know. We know the Bible does not say anything like, well, don't bother with any of that physical kingdom work, since the whole world's going to be thrown out anyway. Just concentrate on saving non-physical souls. The Bible does not say that. The Bible does not say, hurry up, pollute and destroy the world so Jesus can come back sooner. Is there a lot of gross stuff in this world? Yes. Is it overwhelming at times? Yes. Is there a lot that has to change? Yes. Does it feel impossible? Yes. Are we responsible to fix everything? No. But do we get to help? Yes. In thinking about this, Wright offers what I think is it's been helpful for me, this analogy. He writes this: the present world is designed for something which has not yet happened. It's still beautiful, though. It's like a violin. This is perfect this morning, actually. It's like a violin waiting to be played. It is beautiful to look at. It is graceful to hold. But if you've never heard one in the hands of a musician like we have this morning, if you've never heard one, you wouldn't believe the new dimensions of beauty that were yet to be revealed. So for N.T. Wright, this world is like a violin that is yet to be played. And the promise is it will be. And our job is to help it be ready. So what are we to do? There's so many things that we can do, thinking of the world this way. And as human culture twists and turns through history, the answers are always changing. what we are called to do. But there are three categories that N.T. Wright offers up as starting places. And the first one is justice. And we're going to end with these three quickly. Justice. Here comes a lot of ifs. If we are God's image bearers in this world, and if we have been giving the privilege of working with God to help advance the kingdom on earth as it is in heaven, and if we believe that the resurrection of Jesus is the first taste of the transformed creation that awaits us in the future, and if we understand and believe that there is a kind of continuity between this world and the world to come, if all those things are true, then we will be unstoppably motivated to work toward that new world in the present. Where there is injustice, we will want to bring justice. The injustice, as you know, might be against the poor, or the vulnerable, or the needy, or the hungry. There are so many possibilities. It might be against individual persons. The injustice might be against people groups. It might be against the earth itself. And we are called and motivated to bring justice on earth as it is in heaven. The second category he brings to our attention is, I'm happy to say, beauty. Beauty. Resurrection and beauty. God is the great artist who, as we see in early Genesis, delights in the goodness of creation. And as image bearers, we too are invited to delight in the beauty of creation. This is part, by the way, this is part of what Sabbath is about. Take time to stop. Be still, as we heard this morning. And realize we don't have to earn our worth. Take time to delight in creation. In other words, we're called to be the art appreciators in residence. And that appreciation, that delight, often leads many of us to kind of overflow with joy and respond with our own art. Out of an abundance of joy and delight, out of a desire to bear witness and tell the truth. So not only are we the art appreciators in residence, we actually could have a little office door that says artists in residence. That's what we are. We're the artists in residence here. And with the resurrection at the center of our Christian understanding, complete with that idea that the world to come is related to the world that we have now, we see that art is not just yet another opiate of the masses, something to keep us busy, something to pass the time until the world burns up. No, art is something that we do that matters. Our acts of art, lowercase, will somehow become part of or transformed into the great art, uppercase, that is yet to come. We're called to bring beauty. And then the last category, evangelism. N.T. Wright acknowledges that this is a fraught word. Many people associate evangelism with every single awkward mission trip skit that ever ended with Jesus' arms outstretched on the cross. You know those skits. Or evangelicalism sometimes gets confused with evangelism and all the political baggage that comes with that, or emotionally manipulative altar calls. But N.T. Wright proposes another way to think about evangelism. He says, there are church communities or church-like communities where the surprising hope of the resurrection means fear of empire does not reign. Where justice and beauty and loving care for each other and for the earth are central to the communities. And when this happens, the good news, in Greek the evangelion, is being proclaimed, is being lived in the world. All will be made well, we proclaim as a church when we've kept our eye on the resurrection. But it's already started, is the other part of that sentence. Come, be a part of a community that's doing work that's not done in vain. joyful work that'll matter forever. We are called to not just bring that good news, but to live it. So, surprised by hope. Wright says ultimately that the surprise is twofold. First, we're surprised that in the resurrection, we see that death doesn't have the final word, and so that gives us a kind of personal hope. But second, when we see that the ultimate resurrection has a connection with this world, we realize that on earth, as it is in heaven, isn't just a throwaway line. Isn't just a line to have the right number of syllables so the prayer feels right. It means something significant. It means our kingdom work here matters. And as a result, it means thinking about resurrection, thinking about vocation. It means we have every reason in this world and the next to sing. Make us an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let us sow love. Where there is darkness, let us shine light. May your love, God, cause us to open up our hearts. And may your light cause us to shine so bright that we, astonishingly, bring hope into the dark. Amen.